Hello and welcome to Partially Redacted, a podcast where we discuss privacy and security engineering related topics. I'm your host, Sean Faulconer, and today I'm joined by Ashley Joes, product lead at Skyflow, and we'll be talking about data governance, what it is, and why it matters. Ashley, welcome to the show.
Hey, Sean. It's great to be back.
Yes, I actually should have said welcome back to the show. So, obviously you've been here before, and maybe you can fill us in on, what have you been up to since the last episode in December? What's new and exciting in your world?
Yeah, well, I've been busy with my teams. So we recently shipped a new product suite here at Skyflow called Secure Workflows. So it's a set of products that enable customers to orchestrate custom integrations and workflows and migrate millions of rows of sensitive data into a vault. And on top of that, you can also now run custom code within Skyflow's secure and compliant environment. And on the personal side of things, I got to travel to Southeast Asia over the holidays and got to spend some time on the beautiful beaches there. So really glad I got to do that.
Oh yeah, those both sound awesome, but we're actually not talking about either of those things today. I guess we'll have to have you back for a third time to talk about secure workflows. But before, we're going to focus on data governance today, but maybe before we get to the kind of ins and outs of that topic, we can talk a little bit about just the growth of data and the impact that that's had. So there's obviously been a huge amount of data growth in the last few years in terms of how much data businesses are storing, processing, analyzing. And what are your thoughts on how this has impacted the kind of decisions that businesses are making?
Yeah, so you're right. So from a market perspective, I think there are two key trends to be observed, right? So on one hand, we're seeing an exponential increase in data generation, consumption, and storage. And with generative AI and connected devices, we will continue to see an increase in this trend, right? So on the other hand, we're also seeing an increase in regulatory requirements and scrutiny with respect to how organizations store and process customer data. And if you look closely, both these trends don't really play well with each other, right? And cause organizations a lot more pain when it comes to governing data. So in this context, I think organizations with excellent data stewards who are essentially long-term thinkers stand to gain a significant competitive advantage over organizations who often take a short-term piecemeal approach to data governance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that, is a good sort of segue into our topic today. If you're managing large amounts of data, you really can't do that in a way that's probably going to remain secure, compliant, and so forth without comprehensive data governance. So maybe we could start there. Can you explain what data governance is and dive a little bit deeper into, why is that so important in the context of today's data-driven world?
Yep. So I think data governance is typically an umbrella term used to capture everything you need to do to ensure that your data is secure, it's private, it's accurate, available, and usable, right? So it includes the actions that people might take, the processes they may follow, and the technology that supports them throughout the entire data lifecycle, right? So in this world, we talked about the fact that the amount of data being collected is constantly increasing, right? So it becomes really critical to have a good handle on your data, right? And this means a very good understanding of data provenance, which is this idea of knowing where your data has come from, where it sits, and where it might go. So in this context, I think making the right architectural investments early on in your data governance journey can reap a lot of benefits in the longer run. For instance, as an organization expands globally, data localization laws come into effect. And if you haven't really built in data localization and data deletion requests into your governance model, then solving for this as an afterthought at a later stage will become very expensive and complex.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember talking to someone, I won't name the company, but they worked for a fairly famous company, and they talked about how every deletion request from a customer costs them somewhere between $5,000 and $10,000 because essentially they have to pay an engineer to go and find all those locations and actually delete the information. So it becomes a super, super expensive proposition for the business just to track all those things down after the fact.
Yep, I've heard many horror stories like that. So.
Yeah, and you mentioned this idea of data provenance, and I imagine that must be really critical in this world where, auditability of, who's accessing the data, where it is, dealing with data subject requests and so forth by customers is complicated for businesses to manage as well.
Yes. So I think it starts with having a very accurate representation of your entire data workflow, right? Where does it come from? Where is it going? And so on and so forth. So unless you have that, you really don't have a good starting point to solve this problem.
Mm-hmm. So what are some of the like key components of a comprehensive data governance framework?
So I think data security is a key component here, which is essentially all about how you protect access to sensitive data. And this requires principles of least privileged access and zero trust and so on, right? And then there's data quality, which is another one which refers to any activities or techniques which are used to make sure that the data is suitable to be used, right? So, and it's usually measured on accuracy, completeness, consistency, timeliness, and so on. And then you have data management, which encompasses all aspects of managing data as an enterprise aspect, whether it's collecting that data, storing it, or using it, and the oversight that you need to enforce over the usage of that data.
And then how do people, how do businesses essentially go about, actually going from this kind of framework to implementation? Are they, building these types of tools themselves, or, buying various solutions? How does that work from like a technical perspective?
So I think you see a mix of both. So there's certainly more technically capable and organizations which have like huge amount of resources, and maybe data management is a core capability of their business. And you see those type of companies typically investing in these solutions in-house because they can also offer these solutions as products. But then for the rest of us out there, which where we're not really involved in the data business, like think if you're not a data warehouse company or a data analytics company, then it doesn't really make sense to invest in these products and features because it's really not core to our business. So then in those kind of organizations, I think buying a solution often is the better approach here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I imagine as you are dealing with massive data at scale, of course, your problems are going to also scale. So trying to, build something in-house to manage all those problems is going to become a bigger and bigger tax on your business as as you're dealing with more and more data.
Exactly.
So what are the, main challenges organizations face when they're actually going about trying to implement effective, data governance practices, and what is the, impact on the engineering and technical teams, and what role do those teams play in ensuring successful data governance?
Yeah, so a key point of view that we hold here at Skyflow is that all data is not the same, right? So, for instance, customer PII, such as email and contact details, have very different characteristics and regulatory requirements than generic business data, and therefore they must be treated very differently for storage and access. So, now the key challenge for organizations then becomes number one, how do you even identify sensitive data from generic business data? So, to solve for this effectively, you first need an accurate representation of how data comes into your systems. So, are you using web forms to collect data? Are there streaming sources for real time data? Or do you have sensitive data contained in unstructured form factors such as like images and videos and so on? So, now once you've identified all your data flows, it then becomes important to figure out how do you actually isolate sensitive data from the rest of this data. And this piece has its own set of challenges. So it may be easy to identify which column in a CSV file is sensitive, but what about metadata in a medical imaging file that identifies a patient? So now, after you've figured out how to identify sensitive data, the challenge then becomes where do you actually store it, and how do you store it securely, and how do you manage access to it? All right, your files might be in different formats, so you need a data storage platform for sensitive data that is compatible with multiple different formats, and it's globally deployable to meet like data residency needs. So it also needs then fine-grained and dynamic access control features and so on. So there's a bunch of things that need to happen here from a technical implementation standpoint, right? On a related note, like in my 10 years of working as a product manager in enterprise SaaS, a key insight that I've gained that designing systems for the future, but building for today is a very well proven strategy for product execution, right? And this, I think, applies very well to data governance as well. So as technical leaders, if you design your systems to be future-proof, you can avoid a lot of migration pain and operational overhead in the very long term.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's sage advice for anybody that's listening and that's looking to build software. So you talked about this, essentially worldview that Skyflow has and is put forward, where there's essentially different types of data. You have sensitive data, and then you have your non-sensitive data. And sensitive data has to be treated differently and put somewhere else, essentially isolated outside of these existing systems. And is a core part of that from a governance perspective is that sort of the rules of engagement around the sensitive data and the types of operations that you perform on it are just fundamentally different than that of non-sensitive data.
Yes, that's true. And then more importantly, it also makes it easier to manage it, right? So on one hand, the way you deal with sensitive data and the kind of like requirements that are placed on it from a regulatory standpoint are very different than non-sensitive data. So just the very act of isolating it in a secure, centralized place makes the very act of managing it very easy.
Yeah, that makes sense. You're not only isolating the data, but you're also isolating sort of the problem of, remaining compliant, as well as, whatever sort of security controls you want to have around that information.
Exactly. And if you don't do that, right, then what you end up with is a situation where you have this problem of data sprawl, where you have like PII data spread across your internal servers. And then you get into the problem of when you get a data deletion request, how do I go and figure out where does that PII sit to go and delete it?
Yeah, and that's when you're putting out your $5,000 to $10,000 to go pay your the senior engineer on your team to go track down all those locations.
Exactly.
So, what are some of the misconceptions or myths about data governance that you come across, and how do companies think about addressing them?
So I think a common misunderstanding here is that data governance is a technology problem. I think a great data governance implementation is a large org-wide initiative, right? And with any large organizational initiatives, you need to account for people, process, and technology. So let's take a very common example that we see, unfortunately, in the market of data breaches, right? So if you take a look at most data breaches, it's usually some form of a compromised employee credential. Now, from a people perspective, all employees must be trained on what constitutes PII and what are best practices for handling sensitive information and password credentials and so on. So at Skyflow, for example, we do a training session every year on data security and handling PII. So now from a process perspective, you need to then ensure that all new product features that are being built, including specific customer implementations, have passed a security review check before they are shipped in production environments. And last but definitely not the least, from a tech perspective, you then need to ensure that we have multi-factor authentication in place and that we're ensuring principles of least privileged access when it comes to controlling access to sensitive data. So I think getting to a great data governance state involves cross-functional leadership alignment and prioritization, and it's just not an epic in Jira for a specific engineering team.
Sorry for the interruption, folks, but I just had a few quick reminders. If you're enjoying this episode, please hit the subscribe button so you can always get the latest episode. And help others discover the show by leaving a rating and review in your favorite podcast app. Really helps. Last thing, before I get you back to the interview, if you are interested in the topics discussed in this podcast, then you should definitely join the partially redacted community at skyflow.com/community. There, you can meet other interesting and like-minded individuals like yourself, share your expertise, or just passively engage, totally up to you. All right, now back to the show.
Yeah, so it goes beyond essentially a technical problem. We people in product engineering might be sometimes thinking about it in that lens, but a lot of this comes down to essentially potentially a people problem, and training the people involved is key, as well as having the right sort of controls on potentially on their access, or things like two-factor authentication and stuff like that is core and key to having a great data governance program.
Yes.
So with we talked about this rise of big data, advancements in technology. How has data governance evolved over the years? Are there new sort of challenges or opportunities that have emerged?
Yeah, so I think gone are the days of just manual data entry, right? So we now live in a world of automation. So everything is connected and generates tons of data, whether it be your car, your phone, or your watch. And this connected life has really improved our standard of living on one hand. But on the flip side, it's become more important now than ever to ensure that the data being collected is really managed responsibly. Now, you could argue that technology is a root cause of this data management mess, but I think technology can also be the solution. I think, recent advances in machine learning and AI, there are now very sophisticated solutions out there that can automatically detect sensitive data, they can detect fraudulent access and vulnerabilities in code. So, employing these solutions can really help companies with the data governance challenge at a very massive scale.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, you mentioned at the top of the show, which I think comes up probably in everything that I talk about these days around like generative AI and GPT systems and so forth. But there's lots of advancement in AI, and I think one of the value adds that exists there is you can apply these systems to doing a lot of detection around PII, so that you can essentially understand where this data is getting in, potentially from a discovery standpoint, or even from dealing with unstructured data and making sure that you end up not only cataloging that information but treating it the right way.
Yes.
And then we talked a little bit about how Skyflow thinks about some of this stuff, but with Skyflow and the data privacy vault approach, how does something like governance work? We mentioned isolation. But beyond that, what other parts of the governance framework exist in Skyflow's approach to this problem?
So I think as a data privacy vault company, we are solely focused on sensitive customer data, right? So we've built a privacy technology platform that can help manage sensitive data at every stage of its life cycle, right from collection and storage to usage and deletion, right? So within this context, we have implemented the concept of isolate, which implies that PII should be stored separately from the rest of your data. Localize, which means PII should be stored in the right region. And protect, which means protecting access to this data and securely sharing it with third parties. So now we believe that this is the right way to truly address the problem of sensitive data sprawl within enterprises. So now from a feature standpoint, on the collection, we have front-end SDKs that can directly pull in customer PII. So as soon as the customer enters it, so that there's no PII that touches your backend service. We also support like PII identification in existing systems and migration of sensitive data at scale. So we just recently completed a data migration involving over 10 million records for a specific fintech customer into the data privacy vault. On the storage front, we operate globally. So we have customers all over the world who use our privacy vaults to store customer PII locally. We also support highly available infrastructure and security features like VPC peering and so on, right? And on the protect front, we enforce a fine-grained policy-based access control system to govern access to sensitive data. So using our connections product, companies can integrate with third-party services without their systems ever touching sensitive data. And now with secure workflows, you can even run custom code that needs to process sensitive data. So for example, we recently built a function that can tell you if a person is about 21 years of age by running code that can calculate this based on a securely stored image of their driver's license.
Yeah, that's really cool. The driver's license example. Can you also share an example of how some of the policy controls work from like the fine-grained access? Like, how do I go about essentially limiting certain types of users of my application only access to their information or limited set of information?
Yeah, so at the policy base, so at Skyflow we implement a very fine-grained access control mechanism. So we have row level access as well as column level access. So you can now define a policy which can, as a customer agent which is assigned to the state of California, you can now author a policy which grants you access to only those PII information of customers that reside in California. So we have that capability in the product. Another interesting feature I want to talk about with respect to policy-based access control is an advanced feature that at Skyflow that we call context-aware authorization. So there's a non-profit organization out there called OWASP, which stands for Open Worldwide Application Security. And this organization publishes a list called the OWASP Top 10. And that list documents the top 10 application threats that we see in the world today. And one of the top threats here is broken access control, right? This usually happens when you have backend systems that do not have any context on the request being made to check if the user should have access to data or not, right? And this is the same vulnerability that was discovered in one of Uber's APIs, where you could pass another user's ID and get their ride history and so on. So to protect against this, we allow apps to pass the end user context to Skyflow, where we can now enforce row-level security such that the end user can view and update only their own information. So that's just a small tidbit on what we do to protect sensitive data in Skyflow.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And then, would I be able to do something like, let's say, I have users of a system that are like teachers, and I wanted to make it so that, teachers, they not only need to access their own records, but they need to be access, some level of their student records. But then I might have an administrator person that maybe can access all student records, but they don't need to know the grades of those students or something like that.
Exactly. That's another use case of this feature as well, where you can maintain these relationships and define these access control policies that are subject to these relationships between the entity that's accessing the data and the subject whose data is being accessed.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then, beyond some of the work that we're doing at Skyflow and some of the general stuff that you talked around, data governance and data governance frameworks, are there, emerging trends or technologies in the space that you find, interesting or promising, or people that should be paying attention to?
Yeah, I think we touched on this. I think generative AI is all the rage now, and companies are now concerned about what sort of data goes into these large language models, and rightly so, right? But I think these models are very good at identifying patterns. So I think the same technology can be used to identify PII. So we might see a lot of advances in automatic PII detection, especially in unstructured data like images and videos, which has really not been easy to accomplish historically.
Yeah, I mean, it would be really, really interesting if you could essentially take a video stream and somehow identify any of the PII or things that you didn't want to share within the video stream and spit out a redacted version of the video or a clean version of the video.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then do you have any, practical advice or recommendations for, engineers or technical professionals who want to, enhance their understanding or involvement in data governance initiatives within their organizations?
So I think implementing a great data governance model requires conviction and first principles thinking at the technology and executive leadership level. So I implore all technology leaders out there to take a closer look at their data models and take a long-term approach to designing a framework that can scale as your organization scales.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, that's great advice. I feel like, something that is as widespreading as data governance. And, we talked about how this isn't just a engineering or technical challenge. This is also, has to be part of sort of the culture and part of the way you train people within an organization. It probably has to be something that's a top-down motion. It can't be something that's just exists in a silo as, one particular team or sub-team that works on this problem.
Yes.
All right. Well, is there anything else that you'd like to share, Ashley?
I think that was it.
Okay, no problem. Thanks so much for being here. We'll definitely have to have you back. We got to talk about secure workflows at some point. We touched on it today, but there's so much there that I think we could get into, especially around some of the really fascinating use cases that particular product feature enables.
Awesome. Thank you, Sean.
Thanks.